Hello everyone. Hi Ingrid. I haven't washed my hair today, so I've got a hat on. Have you ever done that? We have progressed from doing small stones, mandalas on stones, to working on a 6x6 canvas, and then we started on some 12x12 canvases. And while I will be getting back to doing more patterns on the stones, I wanted to encourage you to get some practice on a larger canvas. So that's what we're going to do today. It's going to be a 16x20 canvas, and I'm going to do it in 2 parts. And I want to encourage you to go online, like I have done, and just look for patterns to do, something that really speaks to you. You can look up other dot mandala work by other artists and try and copy something that they have done. Or you can look up quilt patterns, you can look up stained glass window designs. I've done all of this to try and get ideas for patterns and color combinations just for practice, because that's what artists do. I'm finding out. I haven't taken an art class since I was in high school, so I'm learning all of this as I'm going, and I'm just looking at other artists, seeing what they're doing, trying to make a copy of it, and then I can sort of get an idea for the feel of all the techniques and the spacing and the measurements, and I'm trying to share that with you so that you can learn from my mistakes and some of the things I've done right, and then you can create your own designs, because everybody has their own vision, their own style, their own just how it speaks to them. So we're going to do a large canvas today. Come along with me and we'll answer some questions along the way. Ready? I decided to do this design by Elsbeth McLean because I needed to work on my spacing. She only dots with brushes, and I use dotting tools, so I have a little harder time with it, but I wanted to get some practice. So I have a large canvas here. This is actually rectangular. It doesn't look it in this scene here, but it's a rectangle, and I painted it black, and now I'm putting my guidelines on. And when you're using a rectangle, you can't go corner to corner to get your center grid. So I folded a piece of cardstock that I had left over from a photo album, and I'm using that to mark the corners of a square, and then I'm going to draw my diagonals using those corners, and that'll give me a proper grid. I'm using a chalk pencil, and I have a string on it because I also use it as a compass when I need to draw larger circles. So there, I've got my first diagonal. I'm going to do my second one here. And then I'm going to get the embroidery hoops and do my center circles. To make sure that's perfect, I'm going to measure on each side. Make sure I'm getting it all the same on every side before I start tracing around the outside of the embroidery hoop. And then I can put the smaller hoops in there. I just laid them on there to see what they look like and decided I didn't need the smallest one. So I'm using the medium-sized one. I'm going to trace around that. And that'll give me the guidelines I need for the center part of this piece. Now I need to do the lotus petals at the edge, and I wanted to make sure they were a consistent shape. So I got a piece of paper and folded it in half, and I'm going to draw half of a lotus petal on that. Kind of getting that curvy design, and then I'm going to fold the paper in half and cut it out so I know the curve is the same on both sides. And then hold that up against my grid and see if it fits. It's pretty close. I want it to go halfway across each of those lines, and I'm pretty close, so I'm just going to trim it down a little bit until it fits right in that space. You can see I'm lining the fold of the paper up with the center guideline and then just tracing down the edges. I really like using folded paper when I'm making designs like this, because I can line it up with the underlying grid marks. So I'm going to do this all the way around, and then I'll know that I have a pattern to go with and to try and fit my dots inside of. Because the dots aren't always the same size. It depends a lot on the thickness of the paint and how hard you're pressing, and if you get off just a little bit, you can start to lose your spacing. So these guidelines are going to help me. I'm just showing you some of the paints I'll be using in the first section of this design. I've got some Americana, I've got some Martha Stewart, I've got golden fluid acrylics, which are much more dense in their color saturation. I've got two kinds of white. I've got some Martha Stewart satin, some Martha Stewart pearl, just lots of different types of paint that I mix together. And I'm just going to fast forward here in some of my mixing. I know I'm going to be doing a gradient in the greens and the blues, working my way out. I don't really know what's in the center of Elsbeth McLean's design, because she has a little statue sitting on it, so I'm just kind of guessing here. I'm going to put a green small dot on each of the guidelines, and then 2 dots in between. She really fills up her space with paint. She leaves very little of the background black showing. She's really good at getting the dots very, very close together. So I'm just going to speed through this section. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm just using larger tools as I work my way out, offsetting each row. Give it a shot with a blow dryer, and that will form a skin on that row, because when you start to get into bigger rows, they want to try and bleed into each other. So starting to work my way out, I'm just adding some yellow to the greens. And I decided to use more greenish yellow in this design instead of going right to the blue, because I only had a little bit of blue paint and I needed it for the outside edge of the whole picture there, so I needed to save it. So now I'm just starting to add a little bit of blue to my white, working my way out. And you can see that I've gotten pretty close to my outside circle there. So I'm going to put a white dot in the corner of each petal where it touches the center mandala. And that's going to offset it from the regular tiny dots that I'm using to make that circle. Now I'm filling in with the blues. Here's some of the blues that I used, and this is the consistency of the paint. And I'm going to make a large dot right along the edge of the white circle on each petal on the guideline. Give it a tap so it pulls out and flattens. And then I'll be putting a yellow ring around each of these blue sort of peacock eyes on the petals. Walking those dots around back up to the center ring. When you're working on a piece this size, you end up turning the canvas a lot. You don't want to lay your arm down on wet paint. These are the colors I'm going to be using for the rest of the petal. I wanted these to be intensely bright. And I'm going to start walking these dots around that yellow row. But the way Elsbeth does it is that she will, instead of walking the dots to where they get smaller and smaller, she usually makes hers a consistent size. So all the dots are the same size. So you have to keep reloading your dotting tool to try and get them to be the same size as they're going around instead of getting smaller. And then she will do a much smaller dot on the second row, and then larger dots on the third row. So the spacing, you can't really say, oh, I'm going to offset it or I'm going to line it up with those dots. She really just does a combination of large dots and small dots, row after row after row of this. And somehow she manages to get her spacing right, and I'm still working on it. Getting them close together without touching, trying to leave as little space in between them as possible, and just moving up in size with the dotting tools. This took a little practice. I found that my first rows weren't as nice as I wanted them to be, and I kind of had to fudge with the second row to fill in some of the space. And then when I go back to the smaller rows, same thing. I found that I was having a little trouble getting them lined up perfectly, and it was really noticeable. So I had to move a little slower than I normally do on a rock. I can get a rock done pretty quickly, but this had to take some concentration and just stepping back and looking at it. And I'm sure this is a lot easier to do with a brush. I'm just not very good at it yet. So that's looking pretty good. You can see there's a combination of large dots and small dots in their rows. I'm starting to approach my outside edge, and I can see that the shape of my dotted petal is not the same shape really as my chalk guidelines. So I was starting to figure out how can I fill in that. It's a little wider at the edges. So I started doing fatter dots at the top edge and smaller dots toward the bottom to try and fill in that space. But I still had a long way to go. So I started using larger and larger tools near the white edge to try and start filling in that space, and then walking those down to a smaller tool at the point. And my hope was, even though this isn't exactly what Elsbeth McLean does, I was hoping that when I step back and look at it, it would have sort of the same effect. Cleaning up a little mistake there. You can't see it because my arm is off camera, but I missed with a dot, so I had to quickly grab a Q-tip and get it off of the canvas before it really soaked in. Okay, so I got that row in there and it's looking pretty close. So I thought it's time to start tracing that chalk line with the white paint. And something I noticed on Elsbeth's painting was that she had a fatter dot in the middle of the line, and then she walked it out to small dots at either end. And I tried that, and I really liked the effect. Gave the line a really attractive curve. So I did that on each petal, starting on a fatter dot in the middle and then working out to smaller dots on either side. But I still have gaps. You can see that it's not really filled in on those outer edges. So I just went back and filled those in with the same color paint with just a couple dots. And now I'm going back and doing some top dots in a lighter shade of blue in the middle of the peacock eye. So far, so good. Come back for part 2.